never seen someone stumble this quickly when a feminist questioner's smug and sarcastic jibe at Jordan Peterson over toxic masculinity made her intentions clear. Jordan picked to shreds the false assumptions in that term and left her struggling to respond with a coherent sentence. I think this interaction demonstrates a dozen other things wrong with modern discourse that we need to talk about. But first, take a look at this priceless clip before we get into it.
My question is, what is the antidote towards toxic masculinity?
The antidote is responsible masculinity. And what does responsible mean? It means, well, if you're responsible, then you're trying to do what's honest first. So you're careful with your speech and your actions. You don't say things that you know to be false, so that you don't have to lie about what you do. And then the next thing would be that you're capable of taking responsibility for yourself, at least, so that once you're an adult, no one else has to bend over backwards to ensure that you don't unduly suffer in the world. If you get halfway good at that, well then, you might think about taking on the responsibility of a family and contributing to your community and doing all those things in a harmonious manner. And that's obviously the antidote to toxic masculinity, which is not a phrase I would generally use, because Kant believed that you should act in a manner such that if the way you acted became a universal, that would be beneficial.
I said that didn't cover really a toxic masculinity, right? Because
yes, it's dealing with the principle of reciprocity.
You just said that you have to be honest and responsible as a man. Right?
Well, put it this way. When I'm giving the spoon back to my granddaughter, I'm not engaging in toxic masculinity. What precisely is toxic masculinity, as opposed to, say, toxic femininity or toxic humanity? What exactly are you asking me about?
Well, I really want to know what you like, how you would describe toxic masculinity. Because
no, I want you to define what toxic masculinity constitutes. Since we're going to define things so carefully, let's do it.
I think that the moment when you kind of, I have a hard time to kind of describe it in English. Let's say, that you kind of go over a boundary that kind of neglects the freedom of the opposite, gender or whatsoever. So that's toxic masculinity, and that you kind of have.
But that would also be toxic femininity.
Well, may I? I lost my sentence now. But no. I will be back. I'm back. But more in the sense that. Yeah, can someone help me here in the audience?
You can almost see how mildly Jordan Peterson wanted to answer that question in the beginning, even after that smirk and tongue-in-cheek question referencing Jordan's Antidote to Chaos, which is the subtitle to his second book. But I want you to take a second to think about that answer, saying that the antidote to toxicity is responsibility isn't just another cliche to be said for the sake of it. The truth is, masculinity in itself has traits like competitiveness and degree of aggressiveness that need to be properly channeled, and the only way to do that is, as Jordan puts it, find the biggest burden you can find and then lift it. From a psychological perspective, that means giving men a good cause to be aggressive for and a worthy platform where they can allow themselves to compete. And what happens in a society like ours, where men and their masculinity are constantly derided and shamed? Well, you have those same masculine tendencies start to rear their head in other ways, with things like crime, bullying, and harassment. In a paradoxical way, a society that wants to rid itself of toxic masculinity is actually giving rise to more of it, since we're failing to give men a valuable alternative. Now, let me explain this with an example. It has been reliably shown that boys in preschool and high school on average fare slightly worse in academics than girls of their same age. And a correlation for that is the higher tendency for inattention and hyperactivity in young boys that's just not suitable for making them want to sit down in class and listen. Is that manifestation of masculinity toxic, or is it just something that needs to be channeled with things like outdoor activities, sports, and rough and tumble play? Jordan, being a psychologist himself, understands that it's the latter. It's harder to tame human biology and instinct than to channel it. Though, to be honest, there's hardly anything that's more toxic than attaching that horrible prefix to an idea as broad as masculinity itself. It's a phrase that eats at men's self-esteem and shames them for the very thing that makes them a man. And if society needed any more evidence of that, The last few decades that we've run the social experiment of doing that has shown how masculinity hasn't gone away, but instead just taken different and more dangerous routes. And yet, a term as loaded as toxic masculinity has almost become a throwaway jibe and feminist talking points with no one stopping to think about what it even means. And guess what? The reaction of this questioner suddenly finding herself incapable of defining it is exactly what's happening on a larger societal level. It's triggered by people like Jordan Peterson who refuse to just go along with the popular use of the term and pick apart its layers to show us all that there's really not much underneath it.
I was willing to undertake this line of discussion, allowing for the possibility that the category of toxic masculinity had some content if we're going to pursue that line of reasoning and quibble about the answer, then we're certainly going to quibble about the definition that's embedded in the question. And so part of what's happened in our discourse is that we're required ethically to assume a priori, merely out of politeness, that the utterance toxic masculinity actually constitutes a meaningful phrase. And if you push it, you find very rapidly that it doesn't, because it's very, very, very difficult to define, and definitions actually matter. And so if it's a matter of transgressing against the boundaries of gender-appropriate behavior, well, first of all, that indicates that there's something universal and normative about gender-appropriate behavior, which is something that people who push the idea of toxic masculinity generally tend not to presume. And second, it's just as likely to happen among women as among men, in which case it's not toxic masculinity.
It's kind of a revelation, isn't it? Seeing how quickly she turned from almost trying to put Jordan Peterson into a moral corner, and then suddenly finding herself intellectually cornered instead. If you're going to flippantly throw away terms like toxic masculinity, you better have a definition for it, because here's a maxim you should always bear in mind. Quote, if a word means anything and everything, it really means nothing at all. In other words, unless there's a very strict criteria for both what is toxic and what is masculine, you're not really talking about anything that's worth a separate discussion. Ask yourself if a given toxic behavior is exclusive to men, and then ask yourself how much it has to do with masculinity per se. More often than not, you'll likely find the answer in the negative, at which point the term becomes a hollow slur that happened to gain traction with modern society and not much else. I remember when Jordan's second book came out back in 2018, 12 Rules for Life, and the subtitle to it caused quite a lot of controversy at the time. It read Antidote to Chaos, with Jordan describing chaos as conceptually feminine and order as conceptually masculine. We saw a similar result when Jordan took flack for it in interviews with people that just refused to look at the deeper Taoist philosophy that Jordan Peterson borrows from, and instead get offended over surface-level terms. That's actually a problem that afflicts most of our conversations around contentious debates with race and gender. People arm themselves with buzzwords and euphemisms, pick a side, and start fighting. And I think that's what Jordan diagnosed early on in our modern discourse, leading to him laying out an entire chapter in his book on the importance of being precise in your speech and to tell the truth, or at least don't lie. The interaction you just witnessed is only a microcosm of what is happening on a larger scale with society itself, because a character like Jordan Peterson that stirs the very muddy waters of our culture wars inevitably forces the rest of us to have the tough conversation away from the buzzwords. And yes, he does face a lot of heat for it on the front line of those culture wars, but that just means that a character like him ends up expanding the scope of dialogue for the rest of us. It's up to us now to make the best use of that intellectual space.